She was lying in the corner of an abandoned house, her body trembling from the cold and pain. Hunger burned her from within, and there was no hope. But suddenly, footsteps echoed. One person approached, unarmed, only with a desire to help. Her heart stopped, but when his hand touched her shoulder, she could barely believe that it wasn't yet another deception. The time in the abandoned house had become distorted. It seemed as though there had been no days or nights for a long time. Only cold, only emptiness, only shadows. The walls, cracked and scarred like wounded skin, weathered and forgotten, whispered of a past that had taken warmth and light with it forever. In this house, once filled with life, now only a dead silence reigned. The dog lay in the corner, curled up like a tiny, frightened ball. When her body touched the cold floor, her skin seemed to turn to stone from the chill. Her eyes, once full of liveliness and love, were now dull and empty. They no longer sought affection, no longer waited for happiness. They just watched as time slipped away in the silence of the old house. Watched as everything changed, yet she remained the same. Her name once rang with love, with tenderness. But now it had faded, like everything else. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world where time didn't exist, her call went unheard. She was just a dog, abandoned and forgotten. Now her thoughts were silent, her heart closed, unwilling to open even to anyone who might come in the future. She no longer believed anyone would ever call her by her name again. There was nothing new in the fact that she had been thrown out, but that didn't make the pain easier. She remembered how she had stood by the door, looking at the woman who had once called her friend. She remembered how her eyes darted, searching for some sign, some hint that she wasn't alone. But the woman just closed the door in her face, without a glance, without a word. She heard the woman's last footsteps and saw how her life, her home, moved away, never looking back. For a long time, she couldn't believe it had happened. She kept waiting. Every night, in the shadow of the cold walls, she lived in memories that hadn't yet faded. She remembered lying at her owner's feet, being gently petted while she was told, "You're my girl, loyal and loved." She remembered how they sat together in the kitchen in the evening, with the smell of dinner filling the air, as if they were the only things that mattered in the world. But now it was all just a hazy and weightless echo, blending with the harsh reality that was cold and cruel. Those first days when she still believed she would be returned were the most agonizing. She wandered the streets, darting from one corner to another, searching for a warm spot. Every noise, every creak of a door, every unfamiliar glance made her flinch, hoping it was her. But there was no one. Soon, she realized, she was no longer in this world. She was needed by no one. The cold grew stronger, and with each day her body grew weaker. She could no longer run as she once had. Every movement became a struggle, and her paws, once firm and certain, now barely moved across the frozen earth. She sought shelter in abandoned corners, in sheds under bridges, but it was all the same. Everywhere there was only cold and wind. In the shadows, she tried to hide, shielding herself from a world that no longer wanted her. Illness and hunger became her constant companions. Each morning, she woke feeling her body grow lighter and lighter, as though strength was leaving her, but something inside her still kept her on her feet. Maybe it was hope, or simply the fear that if she fell, no one would come to lift her. But everything was too heavy. She tried to find even a drop of food, but the streets were empty, and the stores were closed. Everything around her vanished, just as her own world had vanished. With each passing day, her condition worsened. At one point, she couldn't even make it to the abandoned house where she had hidden. She could no longer think. She just lay, curled up in the corner on the cold, unyielding floor, waiting, waiting for it to end. Her body could no longer fight, and her gaze slid more and more often across the empty walls, the ceiling where no living creature existed. There was no soul in this world who cared for her, but her heart still hoped. It couldn't believe that life could fall upon her with such cruelty. And while she lay there, eyes closed against the pain, her only friend was the cold that drained her strength, offering no pity, no mercy. The forgotten, broken, exhausted body of the shepherd dog was not ready for the final trial. It was ready to simply disappear, to dissolve into the emptiness, like the last whisper carried away by the wind. Each morning began the same, with darkness. There was no dawn, no light to even slightly melt the gloom. She opened her eyes, feeling how the world pushed her away again, how her body cried out in hunger and pain, how cold had become her eternal companion. She lay in the same spot, in the same corner of the abandoned house, and her body grew weaker, each day resembling less and less the strong being that once ran through the meadow. The cold seeped into her bones, stiffening them, but her heart did not surrender. The remaining strength, like the last sparks of life, fought for every breath, every movement. She understood that she could not stay here forever, that if she didn't find food, didn't find the strength to stand and walk, she would die in this loneliness. But how could she walk? Where could she go? This house was her limit, her enclosed world which was slowly becoming her grave. Despair grew inside her, but it could not completely consume her. There was something more, something that made her move, search, survive. Through the cracks in the walls, light filtered through, faint, weak, like hope. She slowly rose, battling the pain, which grew stronger each time, like bayonets stabbing into her body. Her paws, once firm and confident, were now covered with cracks and abrasions. Every step was agony, but she took it, not for money, not for food. She took that step for herself, for the dog that once believed in people, for the one still hoping to find a place where she could be understood. She walked, knowing she had to move, for death would catch up faster than salvation could come. The cold air carried the smell of dampness and decay, mixing with her own scent of despair. She walked, nearly stumbling, feeling how her paws dragged across the snowy ground, how each step grew harder. And at last she reached the edge of the city. Here, in these abandoned corners, where houses stood empty, and windows were dark and boarded up, she hoped to find at least some food, something that could extend her agonizing life. But instead, she was met with even greater cold. Everything was lifeless. No food, no light, just an endless, empty world, which, to her, seemed merciless, offering no hint of hope for the future. But she did not give up. She crossed the empty street, her fur billowing in the wind, but nothing changed. Only empty boxes, trash, and snow. She kept searching, sifting through piles of garbage for anything she could find. There was no food, only smells that caused even more pain. Hunger burned her from the inside, filling her mind with nothing but hazy thoughts on how to survive. At night, when the stars were hidden behind heavy clouds, she found shelter in an old building, where the roof had almost completely collapsed and the walls cracked like old bones. There was even less warmth here than in her last refuge, but she could not go back. In this place, among the debris, she felt like a ghost, lost, forgotten. But still, she tried to settle on the dirty floor, curling up her paws, trying to keep warm. Suddenly, that night, when everything around seemed so hopeless, she heard footsteps. Weak, unsure, but footsteps. She immediately tensed, her heart skipping several beats, her ears straining. Fear, like a cold knife, ran down her spine. Who was it? A person? Another animal? She tensed every muscle, preparing for the worst. But the footsteps didn't approach. They only faded away. It was just the wind playing in the abandoned house, but she couldn't be sure. The world around her had become an enemy, and every movement was a potential threat. The following days became a struggle with her own demons. Each morning began with the search for food. Each morning was a painful disappointment. Her head grew more clouded, her thoughts tangled. She could no longer think about the past. It no longer mattered who she had been once. The pain from hunger and cold had erased everything from her memory. She was just an animal, desperately trying to survive. And then, during one of her searches, she stumbled upon something that made her heart beat faster. Amidst the trash, in one of the empty courtyards, she found a crumb of bread. It was a tiny, almost inedible thing, but to her, it was a miracle. She grabbed it without thinking. This little morsel was her chance, her last chance. She swallowed it as quickly as she could, feeling something, however small, but warm and comforting, fill her stomach. It was the little bit of relief she had, but the joy was short-lived. Already the next night, the cold once again took over her body, and hunger returned. But she kept moving. Each day, each morning, each night, she kept going, even if her paws could barely hold her, and her heart was filled with nothing but pain, because the only thing left was to hope. Even if it was just a shadow of hope, she kept fighting for her life, step by step. Despite everything, she was already on the edge. Fear, cold, and hunger gripped her body in their merciless embrace, leaving only weak, uncertain breaths that barely registered in the air. Every morning was torture. Each step felt like a sentence. The strength she had lost each day made her weaker, and her mind grew foggier. She no longer thought of the past or hoped for the future. All that remained was the cold, the darkness, the loneliness. But something inside her still wouldn't let her give up. Something kept stirring, like a flicker of light in the dark night despite everything. Days passed, merging into one endless pain. She didn't know where she was, and it no longer mattered. All that mattered was the here and now. Every night became a trial, and each new day, not a promise, but a threat. She could no longer find a shelter that was warmer. She wandered the streets, trembling paws inching towards thresholds, but there was no warmth, no salvation. Just more emptiness, more cold walls. But one day, amidst the endless shadow, at the moment when she almost lost the ability to even think, a sound pierced her ears. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but to her, who had lost all hope, it was a whole world that shattered the silence. She froze, listened, footsteps, precise, calm footsteps. They were coming closer. Fear gripped her heart, and her body became like stone. But then, after a moment, she felt something else. This was not the sound of a threat. This was the sound of care. No, she couldn't believe it. Who could come here, to this abandoned corner where nothing living had been for so long except for her? But the sound didn't disappear. It grew clearer, more definite, and now the footsteps were not an abstraction, but a reality, walking toward her. Slowly, trembling, she stood up on her paws. Pain bound her movements, but fear, that primal fear she felt when she first heard the steps, pushed her to rise. She looked around, trying to see who it was, but in the darkness, even the nearest things were indistinguishable. Her heart raced, as if it were about to burst from her chest. Every nerve in her body tightened. Every movement was filled with uncertainty and desperation. When the figure came into view, all she could do was freeze. A man. He was ordinary, not striking in appearance, but there was something in him that immediately drew her attention. In his eyes, there was something like understanding, something that hadn't existed in her world for a long time. He moved cautiously, as if he knew that every step might frighten her. He wasn't running, shouting, or trying to catch her. He was simply walking toward her, getting closer with each step. Her gaze was full of distrust, like an animal that had lost faith in humans. She still couldn't believe that anyone could truly help. So many times she had seen people walk by her, ignoring her suffering. She clenched her teeth, unwilling to move. She couldn't understand who this person was or what he wanted from her. He came closer, and when the distance between them was minimal, he extended his hand. A thin, trembling gesture, full of caution and tenderness. He was so close now that she could feel his scent, his warmth, something that in this moment felt like the rarest of things. He extended his hand with an expression on his face as if she were the only meaning of his existence in this world. She felt her heart beat faster. She could just turn around and run, retreat into the shadows, as she had always done. But something in her gaze changed. She couldn't explain what, but she felt that this hand was something more. It was not a threat, it was a chance that she could refuse and continue to exist in her world of pain and loneliness. But she didn't want that. Even her wounded soul knew that, perhaps, this was her last chance. She took a step forward cautiously. Her paws trembled, but she moved. Her eyes never left his hand, never left the light that radiated from this simple gesture. Her body quivered, unsure how to react. Everything was new. Everything was frightening. But this was a chance, and she couldn't afford to let it slip away. She carefully touched his hand with her nose, as if checking it for danger. But instead of a threat, she felt warmth, which immediately spread through her cold body. The man didn't withdraw his hand, didn't push her away. He didn't rush. He simply stood there, patiently waiting, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. He waited for her to make a decision. And then, in a moment when her heart nearly stopped from the tension, she finally made up her mind. A moment of hope appeared in her eyes, thin, like a beam of light in the foggy night. She couldn't believe it was possible. But when her paws moved forward and her body grew more confident, she understood. She was ready. Ready to trust. Ready for the unknown. Ready to believe again. She took the final step and found herself standing beside him. He leaned down, gently stroking her head, and in that moment she felt everything soften inside her. His fingers were warm, his touch gentle, and his gaze filled with understanding, with love. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that in that moment her life had changed forever. She was no longer alone. She entered the new world, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this world still wasn't hers. It was a home, a real home, with soft rugs, a fire in the fireplace, and the smell of fresh bread. She felt warmth, something that had been so foreign to her body for so long. She felt how the soft walls protected her, how the people didn't hurt or reject her. There was no cold here, no loneliness, no cruel world in which she had existed all these years. But despite it all, something lingered inside her, like a scar that wouldn't heal. Her paws slid silently and carefully across the wooden floor, as though she couldn't quite believe she was really here. She paused at the threshold, feeling its warm surface, but her body still remembered the icy cold, the endless cold that she couldn't forget. She tried to understand what it meant to be home, why, in this place, it didn't feel the way she had imagined. Her heart was still gripped by fear, and her soul still screamed in the shadow of what had been. The man who had brought her here stood by the door, his hands still extended, as if unsure what to do with her unease. He wasn't in a hurry. He waited. He understood. But he didn't know what was hidden inside her, that every movement she made wasn't just a desire to escape, but a struggle against the invisible chains that still bound her. She looked at him, and in her eyes, a shadow flickered. the shadow of everything she had endured. He couldn't fully understand her. No one could. He could only try. He didn't know what hunger was, what it felt like to have your skin grow thin and your bones crack from the cold. He didn't know what it was like to fear every day that your life would end in this empty, ruined darkness, with no hope for rescue. He didn't know what it was to be betrayed and then abandoned, to not know how to trust again, how hard it was to believe in people. She tried to take a step forward, but her paws trembled. It wasn't from the cold, but from fear. From the fear of once again being in hands that could hurt her. From the fear that this new home, too, might one day turn empty and cold, like all the years of her past. She was afraid. She was so afraid that every movement she made was filled with doubt. The man noticed her indecision, but he didn't tease, didn't rush her. He simply sat on the floor next to her, calmly observing how she shrank, how her body responded to her own demons. He was there beside her, but he didn't hurry, didn't force himself upon her. He didn't know what to say, but he knew that silence was necessary, that she needed time. It was hard, because each second felt like an eternity. But he knew. When she was ready, she would come to him. Her gaze swept over the room. She noticed the soft cushions on the couch, the closed windows that allowed only soft light to filter through. All these things were normal, human things, but to her, they were foreign. She couldn't understand how such simple things could be part of life. She had never known this. Then, unable to hold back, she took the first step. It was a cautious, almost soundless step, as if her paws didn't quite trust the ground beneath her. She rose, moving slowly toward the couch, feeling the soft fabric stretch under her claws. She froze, sensing that this new reality, this new home, frightened her even more than all the empty streets she had walked. But the man didn't rush her. He quietly spoke her name, as if he knew her no less than she knew herself. His voice was warm, deep, but there was no trace of pressure in it. He was simply there. He was the one who hadn't left her, the one who patiently waited for when she would be ready to accept his world. She turned toward him and sat, watching his every move with tension. She couldn't understand what these new feelings meant. When her paws touched the couch, her body tensed immediately. But the man gently stroked her head. She froze, feeling the warm stream of emotions flow from his touch, a warmth that couldn't fully penetrate her. But something inside her stirred. Something in her heart moved gently, like the beginning of new life. Her body relaxed, but only slightly. With each passing moment, she felt her soul trying to open up to this new world. She felt the warm rays of light radiating from the man, but her old wounds were still close. They wouldn't disappear. They wouldn't lose their presence. She felt it on her body, in her heart. But still, it was better than what had been before. Her gaze was full of unease, but there was also a faint spark of something new. If only a hint of hope. This house was not her home. Her heart could not immediately accept it. But she understood that here, next to this man, she could at least begin to believe. To believe that love still existed, that she wouldn't be alone. Through the trembling, through the walls of pain, through the heavy burden of her past, she felt it. She was still alive. And perhaps this house would become her home, despite her broken soul, despite all her wounds. Perhaps one day she would be able to trust again, but it would be a long road, a road that would begin with these first steps, with these first drops of warmth. In her heart, despite all the scars, a spark was lit, a spark that could become a fire.